In the spring of 1912, the world's attention was captured by the grand unveiling of a ship that seemed to defy imagination. The RMS Titanic was more than just a vessel. It was a floating palace, the pinnacle of human achievement at sea, and it was celebrated as the largest and most luxurious ship ever built. At more than 880 feet in length and weighing over 46,000 tons, the Titanic was a marvel of engineering. People from across the globe saw it as a symbol of progress and power, a vessel that represented not only the might of the shipbuilders, but also the faith of an era that believed technology could overcome nature itself. It was the pride of the White Star Line, a ship designed to outshine its rivals in the fierce competition for dominance on the Atlantic crossing. From the very beginning, the Titanic carried with it an aura of invincibility. The press eagerly declared it unsinkable, repeating the claim so often that it became embedded in public imagination. The phrase was not meant as arrogance at first, but as a reflection of its modern safety features. The ship was divided into 16 watertight compartments, designed so that even if 4 of them were breached, the ship would still float. It boasted electronically controlled watertight doors, a double-bottom hull, and the latest in maritime technology. To the world in 1912, it seemed inconceivable that such a vessel could ever meet with disaster. The Titanic was the product of a society dazzled by progress, where steel and steam were thought to conquer all obstacles. When the Titanic prepared to sail from Southampton on April 10, 1912, excitement and pride filled the air. The docks were lined with crowds eager to glimpse the shining new liner, and newspapers wrote of its grandeur with breathless enthusiasm. On board were some of the wealthiest and most prominent figures of the age. Millionaires like John Jacob Astor, Benjamin Guggenheim, and Isidor Straus boarded with their families, enjoying the lavish suites that resembled the finest hotels in Europe. Their quarters were fitted with ornate furnishings, private promenades, and dining rooms where the finest French cuisine was served. These suites represented not merely luxury, but status, a statement that those who sailed on the Titanic were part of the elite at the very top of society. Yet, beyond the gilded dining rooms and glittering chandeliers, the Titanic also carried another kind of passenger. In the lower decks, tucked away from the extravagance of first class, were hundreds of immigrants from Ireland, England, Scandinavia, and beyond. They were families and individuals seeking a new life in America, traveling in third-class accommodations that, while simple, were still far superior to what other ships offered. The Titanic was not only a symbol for the elite, but also a beacon of hope for those who dreamed of opportunity across the ocean. For them, the ship represented the bridge between hardship and possibility, a vessel that could carry their hopes into a brighter future. The journey itself seemed almost dreamlike. As the Titanic left Southampton and made stops at Cherbourg, France, and Queenstown, Ireland, it picked up more passengers and provisions before beginning its transatlantic voyage. Life on board was filled with contrast. In the first-class lounges, orchestras played, ladies strolled in the latest Parisian fashions, and gentlemen gathered in smoking rooms to discuss business and politics. In second class, passengers enjoyed a comfortable middle ground with access to libraries, fine meals, and spacious cabins that rivaled first-class accommodations on lesser ships. Meanwhile, in third class, passengers found themselves with clean bunks, hearty meals, and even shared spaces where they could gather to sing, dance, and play music. The Titanic was more than transportation. It was a world in miniature. Every deck told a different story, from opulence to modesty, from wealth to poverty, yet all were bound together by the belief that this ship was indestructible. Its very existence gave people a sense of security. This was not just another ocean liner battling waves and storms. This was the Titanic, the great unsinkable ship that no one believed could fail. Behind the grandeur, however, were whispers of concern. Some questioned whether labeling the ship unsinkable tempted fate. Others pointed out that while the ship's safety features were advanced, there were still practical oversights. Most famously, the Titanic carried only 20 lifeboats, enough for barely half the passengers on board. This was not considered unusual at the time, as regulations were based on a ship's tonnage rather than its capacity, and lifeboats were seen more as tools for ferrying passengers to rescue vessels rather than as necessities for survival at sea. Yet in the optimism of 1912, these details seemed minor, easily brushed aside by the overwhelming belief in human innovation. For the crew, the Titanic was both a place of work and a source of pride. They had trained to operate one of the greatest machines ever constructed, a ship that pushed the boundaries of maritime technology. Engineers, stewards, cooks, and sailors alike felt they were part of something larger than themselves. Even those who worked tirelessly below deck, tending the roaring furnaces that kept the massive ship moving, carried a sense of duty and accomplishment. To be part of the Titanic's maiden voyage was to be part of history. As the ship sailed westward, cutting through the Atlantic waves with a grace that astonished onlookers, it seemed that nothing could disturb the journey. Passengers dined, strolled along the promenade decks, and marveled at the beauty of the ship. The atmosphere was one of celebration, of confidence, of progress embodied in steel and steam. There was no hint of the tragedy that lay ahead, no shadow of the icy darkness that would soon change everything. The Titanic represented the height of human ambition, the belief that man had finally conquered the seas. But within that very belief lay the seeds of its downfall. By placing so much faith in technology, by calling the ship unsinkable, society overlooked the enduring power of nature and the vulnerabilities hidden within even the strongest designs. The Titanic was not merely a ship. It was a symbol of an age, and when it met its fate, the world would realize just how fragile even its greatest achievements could be. And so, as the great ship sailed confidently into the Atlantic on its maiden voyage, passengers and crew alike carried with them dreams, ambitions, and a certainty that nothing could go wrong. No one on board could have imagined that within a matter of days, this symbol of progress would become a legend of tragedy forever, remembered as the Titanic disaster that shook the world. On the night of April 14, 1912, the Titanic moved steadily through the icy waters of the North Atlantic, carrying more than 2,200 souls on its maiden voyage. For 4 days, everything had seemed routine. The ship had left the shores of Europe behind, and the weather was calm, the seas unusually smooth, almost eerily so. Passengers had settled into life aboard, enjoying the routines of meals, social gatherings, and the novelty of sailing on what had been hailed as the greatest ship ever built. But beneath the calm surface of that night, danger was waiting, silent and unseen. Reports of icebergs had been received throughout the day from other ships in the area, messages warning of large ice fields drifting across the Titanic's path. Yet the Titanic pressed on at nearly full speed, confident in its reputation and in the belief that such warnings posed no serious threat to a vessel of its size and strength. The night itself was strikingly clear. The stars glittered in the sky, brighter than most passengers had ever seen, because there was no moon and no cloud cover to dim their light. The sea was described as being like glass, so still that waves barely broke against the ship's hull. But that same stillness made icebergs far harder to detect, since the usual white foam of waves breaking against them was absent. In the crow's nest, 2 lookouts scanned the horizon with naked eyes, their binoculars missing due to a key mistakenly locked away before the ship had sailed. They stood in the cold, straining to see anything unusual against the dark sea ahead. At 11:40 p.m., one of the lookouts suddenly spotted a massive shadow looming directly in the ship's path. At first it appeared as nothing more than a darker shape against the night sky, but within seconds it revealed itself as a towering iceberg, jagged and menacing, rising high above the water. The alarm bell was rung 3 times, and the urgent cry of "iceberg right ahead" echoed down to the bridge. First Officer William Murdoch, in command at the time, acted instantly. He ordered the ship's engines reversed, and the wheel turned hard to starboard in a desperate attempt to avoid a head-on collision. For a moment, it seemed the Titanic might succeed. The ship began to turn, and the iceberg slid past the starboard side. But then came a sound that survivors would remember forever, described not as a violent crash, but as a series of eerie, muffled, grinding noises. Beneath the surface, the icebergs. Jagged edge tore through the hull plates, puncturing them one after another, reaching the ship's watertight compartments. It was not a single, catastrophic tear, but a series of gashes that stretched across more than 300 feet of the Titanic's side. Water began pouring in at an unstoppable rate. At first, many passengers were unaware of the collision. In the first-class dining rooms and lounges, the impact felt like nothing more than a faint vibration. Some described it as if the ship had gently run over something, a minor bump in an otherwise smooth journey. In third class, the noise and shudder were more noticeable, but even there, few realized the seriousness of what had happened. People joked, peered curiously through portholes, or went back to bed, convinced that on a ship like the Titanic, nothing could truly be wrong. Down in the lower decks, however, the situation was starkly different. Crew members working in the boiler rooms felt the icy water rushing in almost immediately. Bulkheads were breached, and men scrambled to escape the rising flood. Within minutes, 5 of the ship's forward compartments were filling with water. The Titanic's design allowed it to stay afloat with up to 4 compartments flooded, but 5 meant doom. The ship's fate had been sealed at the very moment of collision. Captain Edward Smith was informed, and he quickly realized the grim reality. The Titanic was sinking. The order was given to prepare the lifeboats. Though few on board understood the urgency, passengers still clung to the belief that the ship was unsinkable. Many refused to leave the warmth and comfort of the grand lounges for the freezing night air, certain that this was only a precaution and that they would soon return to their cabins. The ship itself appeared steady, showing no immediate signs of distress, and this calm exterior misled many. But below the waterline, the Atlantic was flooding in, unstoppable, dragging the Titanic closer to her end. As the minutes passed, the truth began to spread. Crew members moved through the decks, urging passengers to put on life jackets and head toward the lifeboats. Still, confusion reigned. The Titanic carried lifeboats for only about half of those on board, and even those were not filled to capacity in the first hours. Some passengers resisted leaving the luxury of the ship. Others feared climbing into the small wooden boat suspended over the dark ocean. There were accounts of people laughing, chatting, and even continuing their games of cards, convinced there was no real danger. But for those who had seen the water rushing in, there was no doubt. The ship was doomed. The collision with the iceberg was not the spectacular crash that people might imagine. It was quiet, almost deceptively so, but its consequences were catastrophic. A sequence of small breaches became a chain of destruction that no engineering could withstand. The Titanic had been built to defy disaster, yet in that silent moment at 11:40 p.m., nature had proven stronger. What seemed like a glancing scrape was in fact the death sentence of the ship, a blow from which there was no recovery. As the Titanic continued forward, now mortally wounded, the great liner that had been hailed as unsinkable was transformed into a floating trap. Passengers still walked the decks unaware, some gazing at the stars, others preparing for bed, while below their feet, water surged into compartments at an unstoppable pace. The great ship's story had changed in an instant. What began as a triumph of human ambition had turned into a nightmare, a disaster that would unfold slowly, hour by hour, as the reality of the collision became undeniable. And so, on that clear and starry night in April, the Titanic's fate was sealed by the silent strike of an iceberg, a moment that turned a voyage of dreams into a tragedy that would echo across history. In the minutes and hours after the iceberg's blow, the sense of calm that had marked the Titanic's voyage gave way to confusion, disbelief, and eventually chaos. At first, most passengers did not fully grasp what was happening. The ship, though wounded, remained steady, and on deck there was little visible sign of danger. When officers and crew began to rouse people from their cabins, urging them to put on life jackets and head toward the lifeboats, many resisted. In first class, where the lounges still glowed with electric light and where the orchestra continued to play soft melodies to ease nerves, it seemed absurd to think the Grand Titanic could be in any real peril. Ladies wrapped themselves in furs, and men in overcoats, stepping outside more out of curiosity than fear. In second and third class, too, many were reluctant to leave behind their belongings, or they assumed this was only a safety drill, nothing more. But below the surface, the truth could not be ignored. Water poured into the forward sections of the ship, rising relentlessly and forcing engineers, stokers, and firemen to abandon their posts. Those who witnessed the flooding knew there was no time to waste, but as the message spread to the decks above, it met with disbelief. Passengers laughed nervously, assuring each other that the Titanic could not sink. After all, that was the reputation it carried into the voyage, a ship described by press and company alike as practically unsinkable. The very belief that had made the Titanic famous now lulled its passengers into a deadly complacency. The crew, following Captain Smith's orders, began loading the lifeboats. It quickly became clear that there were not nearly enough for everyone on board. The ship had only 20 lifeboats sufficient for about half the passengers and crew, a decision made more to satisfy outdated maritime regulations than to truly ensure safety. Yet in those first crucial moments, even the limited lifeboats were not filled. Many passengers hesitated to climb into the small wooden craft dangling over the icy black water. Why leave the solid, brightly lit Titanic for what seemed like a fragile and dangerous alternative? The first lifeboats lowered into the sea carried far fewer people than they could hold, some barely half full, while hundreds more remained on deck, convinced they were safer aboard the ship. As the minutes passed and the ship began to tilt, reality slowly forced its way into the minds of passengers. The bow dipped lower, the deck sloped ever so slightly, and icy water sloshed onto the lowest levels. Suddenly, the calm was broken by rising tension. Families were separated as women and children were urged into lifeboats, while men, even wealthy and influential ones, were told to stand back. The ship's policy of women and children first was enforced, sometimes strictly, sometimes chaotically, depending on the officer in charge. Heart-wrenching scenes played out across the decks. Husbands bidding farewell to wives, fathers, kissing their children one last time, friends embracing in silent resignation. Some men tried to sneak aboard the lifeboats disguised as women, while others, like Isidor Strauss, chose to remain behind, refusing to abandon their spouses. In third class, the situation was far worse. Passengers in the lower decks struggled to find their way up through the maze-like corridors. Language barriers, locked gates, and a lack of crew guidance delayed their escape. Many never reached the lifeboats at all. Those who did often found them already lowering away. For the immigrant families who had pinned their hopes on this voyage, the disaster turned cruelest of all, trapping them in a nightmare of confusion and loss. As lifeboats began filling more quickly, the scene grew. Increasingly desperate, the tilt of the ship became more noticeable, forcing people to cling to railings as they moved. The icy wind bit harder, and the reality of the freezing water became clear. People began to understand that staying aboard meant death. Shouts echoed, children cried, and the sound of orders being barked by officers mingled with the steady hum of the ship's engines still running deep below. The lights continued to blaze, giving the decks an almost surreal atmosphere, as though the grand liner was still hosting its nightly entertainments, even as fate closed in. The orchestra played on through it all, their music drifting across the cold air. Some said it was to maintain calm. Others believed it was an act of bravery to soothe the fear that gripped the ship. Whatever their reason, the musicians refused to stop, their melodies becoming the soundtrack of the unfolding disaster. Survivors would later recall those final notes with haunting clarity, a memory forever tied to the chaos and panic of the sinking. By now, the lifeboats were in higher demand, and passengers pressed forward, desperate for a chance at survival. Some boats were lowered hastily, ropes creaking under the strain. Others were launched with barely any provisions, no lanterns, and in some cases, not even an officer to command them. Those left behind crowded the railings, watching as the tiny craft vanished into the darkness, carrying with them the last fragile hopes of escape. The sea was calm, but the cold was merciless, and anyone who ended up in the water without a boat faced almost immediate death. As chaos spread, Captain Smith moved through the decks, urging calm, giving orders, and finally resigning himself to the fate of his ship. He had commanded one of the most celebrated vessels in history, and now he stood helpless as it slipped toward destruction. Officers, too, faced the impossible task of controlling the crowd and choosing who would live and who would die. Some showed remarkable discipline and courage. Others faltered under the pressure, but all were caught in the grip of a disaster no one had believed possible. The ship that had once symbolized triumph now echoed with cries of fear, with arguments at lifeboats, with the desperate scramble of humanity trying to survive. What began as disbelief had turned into chaos, and what had been a voyage of luxury had transformed into a fight for life. The Titanic's proud decks were now a stage for tragedy, and as the lifeboats drifted farther into the dark sea, those who remained could only watch helplessly, knowing their time was running out. The Titanic was no longer just a wounded ship. It had become a vessel of panic and loss, where chaos spread faster than order, and where the icy waters below promised a cruel end for those who could not escape. The true scale of the human tragedy began to unfold as the Titanic continued to sink, dragging itself deeper into the freezing Atlantic with every passing minute. By now, the slant of the decks was no longer subtle. It was obvious. People clung to railings and furniture as they moved, struggling to keep their balance. The bow dipped further, forcing passengers higher toward the stern. The confidence that had once filled the ship was gone, replaced by dread. Everyone who still stood aboard knew they were trapped in a race against time, and the ocean was winning. The lifeboats that had once been launched half full were now a fading sight in the darkness, their silhouettes bobbing on the calm sea, carrying hundreds away from the doomed liner. But on the ship itself, more than 1,000 souls remained. These were men, women, and children who had no place left to go. The realization struck with full force. Not everyone would survive. For every lifeboat lowered away, dozens were left behind, staring after it in despair, their hopes dwindling as the night grew colder and the water rose higher. The third-class passengers suffered the cruelest fate. Many had never made it to the upper decks in time. Confusing passageways, locked gates, and the overwhelming crush of people slowed their escape. Families were torn apart in the scramble to climb staircases or force their way past barriers. Some did manage to reach the boat deck, exhausted and terrified, only to find the lifeboats already gone. Their journey had begun as a hopeful voyage to America, a chance to start anew, but now it was ending in a struggle simply to breathe and to live for another hour. On deck, the separation of families brought unbearable sorrow. The rule of women and children first was carried out unevenly, sometimes strictly enforced, sometimes relaxed, but always leaving someone behind. Mothers held their children tightly, some refusing to leave their husbands even when urged to board lifeboats. Couples kissed goodbye, knowing it was the last time. One of the most famous examples was Isidor and Ida Strauss, the elderly couple, who owned Macy's department store in New York. When offered a place in a lifeboat, Isidor refused, insisting that he would not take the seat of another man. His wife, Ida, made her choice in that moment, declaring she would not be separated from her husband after decades of life together. They stayed aboard, arm in arm, facing death as one. Elsewhere, similar sacrifices and decisions played out. John Jacob Astor, one of the richest men on board, helped his young pregnant wife into a lifeboat and then calmly stepped back, accepting that his fate was sealed. Benjamin Guggenheim, another millionaire, changed into his evening clothes and told those nearby that he and his valet were dressed in our best and prepared to go down like gentlemen. In the lower decks, lesser-known men and women faced the same choices, many giving up their chances for the sake of children or loved ones. The human tragedy was not just in the separation of families, but in the cold numbers. The sea itself was an enemy. At just above freezing, it could kill within minutes. Those who fell or jumped into the water had little chance. Their cries pierced the night as hundreds eventually entered the ocean, clinging to wreckage or struggling in vain to keep afloat. Survivors in lifeboats later recalled the haunting sounds of desperation, the wails and screams of those left behind. Slowly, those cries faded, replaced by silence. The disaster also revealed the cruel inequality of the era. The wealthy of first class had better access to lifeboats, while the poor of third class were often left behind. Statistics from the tragedy make this bitter truth clear. A higher percentage of first-class women and children survived than those in third class, many of whom never even reached the upper decks before it was too late. For those who had once dreamed of a new life in America, the dream ended at the bottom of the Atlantic dot, yet within the unfolding nightmare, there were acts of astonishing courage. Crew members risked their lives guiding passengers to safety, and some officers remained at their posts until the very end. The ship's wireless operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, continued to send distress signals long after they knew their own lives were at risk. Musicians, led by Wallace Hartley, famously played on until the ship's final moments, their music a fragile comfort against the rising tide of fear. Ordinary passengers, too, showed bravery, some giving up lifeboat seats to strangers, others comforting those who knew they would not escape. The Titanic carried over 2,200 people when it left Southampton, but by the time it slipped beneath the waves, more than 1,500 had perished. Fathers were torn from children, husbands from wives, friends from companions. The tragedy was not only in the scale of death, but in the way it struck across every level of society. The rich, the poor, the famous, the unknown, all were reduced to the same desperate fight for survival against the cold indifference of the sea dot as the stern of the Titanic lifted higher into the night sky. Those still on board clung to railings, scrambled upward, or simply stood in resignation. Some prayed, some wept, others screamed for help that never came. The final minutes were filled with human voices rising into the darkness, a mixture of panic and sorrow that no one who survived could ever forget. What made the tragedy so profound was not just the number of lives lost, but the stories behind those lives, the unfulfilled dreams, the farewells cut short, the families never reunited. The sinking of the Titanic was not merely the loss of a ship. It was the shattering of thousands of hopes carried across the ocean. It was a reminder that in the face of nature's power, human pride and progress could be swept away in a single night. And as the last cries faded into silence, the great Titanic was no more, leaving behind an ocean littered with wreckage and a world forever haunted by the memory of the lives it claimed. Among the shadows of fear and despair on that freezing April night, there emerged moments of courage, sacrifice, and endurance that would forever be remembered as part of the Titanic's story. Even as the ship's fate became undeniable, individuals both, passengers and crew, rose above their own terror to comfort others, to help strangers, and to face the end with a dignity that has become legendary. These stories of heroes and survivors bring light to one of the darkest nights in history, showing how humanity can shine brightest even as death closes in. Asterisk. One of the most striking accounts of bravery came from the ship's band, led by Wallace Hartley. 8 musicians continued to play long after the collision. As panic spread and lifeboats filled, their music carried across the decks, soothing nerves and offering a fragile sense of normalcy in the chaos. Survivors recalled hearing familiar hymns and popular tunes drifting through the cold night air, even as the ship listed more sharply and the sea rose around them. None of the musicians survived, but their final performance left an indelible mark. They chose to meet death not with screams, but with song, a gesture of comfort for others in their final moments. Asterisk. Acts of bravery were not confined to music. Crew members fought to the end to save as many as possible. Wireless operators Jack Phillips and Harold Bride remained at their posts, sending desperate calls for help even as water filled their cabin. Their signals were picked up by nearby ships, including the Carpathia, which would eventually race to rescue survivors. Phillips never made it out alive, but his work ensured that hundreds of people in lifeboats were saved. Asterisk. Officers, too, faced impossible choices. Some enforced order at the lifeboats, drawing lines between who could leave and who had to stay. Second Officer Charles Leitler was particularly strict in his interpretation of the women and children first policy, allowing no men to board his boats unless they were needed to row, though criticized later for sending some lifeboats away underfilled. He himself survived by clinging to an overturned collapsible boat until dawn. Other officers did not live to tell their stories, choosing instead to remain with the ship, maintaining discipline as long as possible. Asterisk. Among the passengers, bravery appeared in many forms. Margaret Molly Brown, later known as the Unsinkable. Molly Brown was one of the most celebrated survivors. After being placed in Lifeboat 6, she urged the crewman in charge to return to rescue more people, though he refused out of fear the boat would be swamped. Later, she rallied the women in her boat to row through the freezing night, taking turns at the oars until rescue came. Her courage, leadership, and refusal to give in to despair earned her a place as one of the Titanic's most enduring legends. Asterisk. There were also passengers who met their fate with a stoic acceptance that struck others as heroic. Benjamin Guggenheim, a wealthy American industrialist, famously returned to his cabin after helping others to safety. He changed into evening dress and told a steward, "We've dressed up in our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." He and his valet gave away their life jackets, choosing instead to face death with calm dignity. His words and actions were remembered as a final act of grace. Asterisk. Stories of survival are perhaps even more haunting, for those who lived carried the weight of memory for the rest of their lives. Take the case of Violet Jessup, a stewardess who had worked aboard both the Olympic and the Titanic, and who would later survive the sinking of the Britannic during World War I. On the Titanic, she helped women and children into lifeboats before being ordered into one herself to demonstrate safety. Against all odds, she lived through three of the greatest maritime disasters of her age. Asterisk. Then there were children who survived while their parents were lost forever. The Titanic orphans, two French boys aged 2 and 4, were placed in a lifeboat by their father, who did not survive. Unable to speak English, they were taken aboard the Carpathia and became famous in newspapers as the waifs of the sea, until their mother was located weeks later. Their story revealed not only the tragedy of separation, but also the unexpected chances of survival in a night of overwhelming loss. Asterisk. For those in the freezing water, survival depended on sheer will. Lifeboats were scarce, and hundreds ended up clinging to debris or overturned collapsible boats. Second Officer Lidler and about 30 others managed to survive on one such overturned craft, balancing precariously for hours as waves washed over them. Men clung side by side in silence, too cold to speak, waiting for a dawn they were not sure would come. Some slipped away during the night, their frozen hands losing their grip. Those who endured owed their lives not just to luck, but to the determination to hold on until the very end. The heroism extended beyond individual acts to collective resilience. Many lifeboats drifted aimlessly in the darkness, half filled with passengers shivering in silence. Some, like Molly Brown's boat, kept rowing to keep warm and to distract themselves from the cries coming from the water. Others huddled together, praying, weeping, or sitting in stunned disbelief. No one knew if help would come, or if they were doomed to die slowly of cold and hunger as the sea swallowed the ship behind them. Yet, despite fear, survivors tried to comfort one another, strangers bound together by a shared catastrophe. Asterisk. The stories of those who endured the night remind us that survival was not only a matter of circumstance, but of spirit. Some refused to surrender, holding on until the Carpathia appeared on the horizon. When the rescue ship finally arrived, hours after the Titanic sank, lifeboats filled with shivering survivors were brought aboard. Many wept openly as they realized how many had been lost. The cries of the drowning had long since faded into silence, leaving behind an ocean littered with debris and the faint glow of the dawn. Asterisk. For the survivors, the journey did not end with rescue. They carried with them the scars of that night, the faces of loved ones left behind, the sounds of the band playing, the desperate calls for help in the cold dark. For the rest of their lives, they would tell and retell their stories, each memory a mixture of horror and gratitude, guilt and relief. Their survival was a testament to human resilience, but it was also a reminder of the randomness of fate, of how a seat in a lifeboat or a decision made in a moment could mean the difference between life and death. Asterisk. The Titanic's sinking was a tragedy of epic proportions, but within it were countless moments of human courage. From the musicians who played as the ship went down, to the crew who gave their lives performing their duty, to the passengers who put others before themselves. These acts of heroism stand alongside the horror as proof that even in the face of certain death, dignity and compassion can endure. And for those who survived, their lives became living testaments to one of history's most unforgettable nights. Asterisk. And when dawn finally broke over the North Atlantic, those who had lived to see it carried within them not only the memory of loss, but the enduring stories of courage that rose from the depths of the Titanic's final hours. When the Titanic finally slipped beneath the surface of the Atlantic in the early hours of April 15, 1912, the world awoke to a disaster so immense that it seemed almost impossible to comprehend. Newspapers in Europe and America raced to print the first reports, many of which were confused and contradictory. Some claimed the ship had struck an iceberg, but that all passengers were safe. Others spoke of damages, but assured readers that the Titanic was being towed to port. Families waited anxiously, clinging to hope that their loved ones had survived. It wasn't until the Carpathia steamed into New York 3 days later carrying only about 700 survivors, that the grim truth became undeniable. More than 1,500 lives had been lost in the sinking of a ship that had been hailed as unsinkable. The world was shocked not only by the scale of the loss, but also by the manner of it. How could such a modern marvel of engineering, equipped with watertight compartments and the latest technology, have been brought down by an iceberg? And how could so many have died when the ship had hours before it finally slipped beneath the waves? The answers came slowly, revealed through inquiries and testimonies. But the realization struck with painful clarity. Human error, complacency, and outdated safety practices had turned the Titanic into a death trap. The tragedy exposed deep flaws in the way ships were regulated at the time. Chief among them was the lifeboat situation. The Titanic carried lifeboats for just over 1,100 people, far short of the 2,200 on board. Regulations had not kept pace with the size of modern ships, requiring lifeboats only according to a vessel's tonnage rather than its passenger capacity. This meant that even though the Titanic had been technically within the law, it had not been adequately prepared for an emergency of such scale. The sight of half-filled boats drifting away into the night, leaving behind hundreds who begged for rescue, became one of the most haunting symbols of the disaster. Investigations in both Britain and the United States quickly followed. Survivors gave testimonies about the confusion on deck, the lack of drills, and the refusal of many passengers to believe the ship was truly sinking until it was too late. Crew members described the desperate struggle to enforce order at the lifeboats, and the heartbreaking scenes of families torn apart. These inquiries not only sought to uncover the truth, but also to assign responsibility. The White Star Line defended itself, pointing to the iceberg as an unavoidable act of fate. Yet many argued that arrogance and negligence had played as large a role as nature. One of the immediate outcomes of the inquiries was a complete overhaul of maritime safety laws. Ships were now required to carry enough lifeboats for every single person aboard. Lifeboat drills became mandatory, and crews were trained to handle evacuations more effectively. The Titanic's wireless distress signals, which had summoned the Carpathia, also highlighted the need for round-the-clock radio operators on all passenger ships. Before the disaster, many ships had wireless equipment, but did not keep it manned at all hours. After Titanic, it became law that someone must always be listening, ensuring that no distress call would go unanswered. Another major reform was the establishment of the International Ice Patrol, an organization created to monitor iceberg activity in the North Atlantic and warn ships of potential dangers. For the first time, nations cooperated to prevent a similar tragedy, using technology, ships, and later aircraft to track ice fields and protect vessels crossing the ocean. This direct legacy of the Titanic remains active even today, more than a century later, safeguarding the very waters where the great liner was lost. But beyond regulations and reforms, the sinking of the Titanic left a cultural scar. It became a story of hubris, the belief that man's creations could conquer nature without consequence. The ship had been advertised as unsinkable, a phrase that echoed through every headline and passenger's mind. Its fate proved the danger of such overconfidence. To many, the Titanic's end symbolized the limits of human progress, a sobering reminder that even in an age of steel and technology, mankind was still vulnerable to the elements. The human cost of the disaster was felt in homes across the world. Families who had sent loved ones to America in search of a better life learned they would never arrive. Entire communities, especially in Ireland and Britain, mourned the loss of dozens of young men who had worked as crew. Wealthy families in New York and London lost prominent figures, their names etched into the story alongside those of ordinary immigrants whose lives were cut short. Memorials were built in cities across the world, from Southampton to Halifax, from New York to Belfast, each one bearing the names of those who perished. For the survivors, the Titanic never left them. They carried its memory in their words, in the nightmares that followed, and in the stories they shared with the world. Some, like Molly Brown, became public figures celebrated for their courage. Others lived quietly, reluctant to revisit the trauma. Children who had been pulled from lifeboats grew old with the burden of remembering the night their parents disappeared into the sea. Every survivor, no matter their class or background, carried a lifetime of questions. Why had they been spared when so many others had not? In the decades that followed, the Titanic grew into more than just a disaster. It became a legend. Books, films, and songs retold its story, blending fact with myth, until it became one of the most enduring tragedies in modern history. The wreck itself lay hidden beneath the waves for more than 70 years, until it was discovered in 1985, lying in two great pieces on the ocean floor. The images of its broken hull stirred the world's imagination once more, bringing the tragedy vividly back to life and reminding us of the human lives behind the rusting steel. The Titanic changed history not only through the reforms it inspired, but also through the lessons it taught about human pride, preparedness, and compassion. It showed the danger of underestimating nature, the cost of placing profit and prestige above safety, and the importance of valuing every life equally. More than a century later, the sinking remains a story told across generations, not because it was the only maritime disaster of its kind, but because it revealed so much about the human spirit, its flaws, its resilience, and its capacity for both error and heroism. And so, the Titanic, once the grandest ship afloat, lives on not just in the depths of the Atlantic, but in memory, law, and legend, forever reminding us of the night when hubris met tragedy and the world was forced to change.